pasture. Anyway, for Samara's memorial, it's going to be tomorrow, Sunday the 24th. I think I said Saturday the 24th, so Sunday the 24th is when her memorial is. So if you want more information about that, please see me. Born on the planet Krypton with the birth name of Kal-El, this baby was sent to Earth by his parents in a small spaceship shortly before Krypton was destroyed in a natural cataclysm. His ship landed in the American countryside near the fictional town of Smallville. He was found and adopted by farmers Jonathan and Martha Kent. This boy began to develop various superhuman abilities, such as incredible strength, impervious skin, and others. His adoptive parents advised him to use his powers for the benefit of humanity, and he decided to fight crime as a vigilante. To protect his personal life, he changes into a colorful costume and uses an alias when fighting crime. Who am I? Superman? You guys knew that? Origin stories are an important thing, right? If you're big into either Marvel or DC, as Superman is, or really any other sort of lore, stories, Star Wars, when you think about the protagonist, there's always that backdrop. And for the last, I couldn't believe it when I looked back at my notes, the last 4 months, we have been going over the origin story of Jesus Christ. We have been talking about the background of his parents, where he came from, all the prophecies of when the chosen one was going to come. No, it's not Anakin Skywalker. No, it's not Superman. We're talking about Jesus Christ. And origin stories really they're like the myths, they're the folklore, they're these things that bring together people around, again, the protagonist. And also the antagonist, because, there's always that arch nemesis, Lex Luthor, or Satan the devil, whomever it is, depending on the individual you're considering. But as we have spent the last 4 months going over the origin story of Jesus, all of his pre-ministry side of things, I thought I'd like to wrap it up today by looking back a little bit retrospectively at why it is I thought this is something, hey, we should focus on this. So let's turn over to Luke chapter 1. We're going to actually conclude where we began. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. What is it that we can draw from all that we covered? We covered a lot. Timelines, people, all sorts of minutia. What is it that we can draw to help us in our Christian walk from what we've discussed or looked at over the last 4 months? Luke chapter 1, verse 1. He writes, "Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed." We went over this and we talked about this is why Luke puts together his gospel. He says, I wanted to put it together. I've been convinced of it, he says, from the very beginning. And other people have written some things down, but I wanted to talk to the eyewitnesses. I wanted to record what they had seen so that you, and I by extension, may know the certainty of those things in which we have been instructed. That's his rationale for this. And that's actually what I want to focus on as we're talking about why it is that we went back through all the details and all the information that we did regarding Jesus Christ. The first reason is to seek eyewitnesses. To seek out eyewitnesses. When we're talking about why we do the peculiar things that we do, what is it that brings us along to a point of saying, yeah, I'd like to go counterculture counter Christian culture, and keep the Sabbath, keep the holy days, observe what it is that we see in Scripture. What is it that makes us want to do that? What would drive us to do those things? That's why Luke was recording this. He's saying, I went and I talked to these people. I saw it. Seek out eyewitnesses. Let's go to John chapter 9. Keep your spot here, and well, you don't have to keep your spot here, Luke. We'll come back to it later, but let's just go to John chapter 9. John 9, we'll read the verses 1 through 11. John 9, 1 through 11. As we consider our Christian walk and we consider what it is that we can learn from Jesus, what it is that we can learn from the account of Luke and why it is he wrote it, seeking eyewitnesses can be really, really advantageous, very helpful. Luke chapter 9, verse 1. Now as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Again, this is one of those things, it's a reasoning fallacy. We can fall into it. If you're doing well and you're not having trials, obviously you're righteous, you're blessed, God loves you. That's why you're not getting any trials. And if you're having trials, sinner. Everybody knows it. That's why you're going through these difficulties, right? And this is how they were thinking at that time. And Jesus answered and said, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day, and night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he had said these things, he spat on the ground and made clay with his saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with clay. And he said to him, go, wash in the pool of Siloam. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Therefore, the neighbors and those who previously had seen that he was blind said, is not this he who sat and begged? Some said, this is he. Others said, it looks like him. And the man's like, yeah, that was me. I am he. Therefore they said to him, how were your eyes opened? He answered and said, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and received sight. Quite literally, an eyewitness. An individual who could not see beforehand now can see. And if you follow the account, it's actually pretty humorous account, because the poor man gets kicked out of the church, his parents get kicked out of the synagogue. They don't get to come because he's like, I don't know what else to tell you. I was blind, now I see. How can you call this anything but a miracle? They boot him from the church. But I think the interesting thing is, for him, he saw it. He accounts it, or he attributes the effect to the individual who did the work. He says, oh, this is the work of God through Jesus. This is the man. He anointed me. Now I can see. And so he's attributing it to Jesus Christ, attributing it to God through that. And for him, it was enough. Obviously, for the others who were there, they questioned it. Have you ever seen something? It's like Clark Kent. Is that Superman? Is that not? It looks like him. Can't quite tell. Right? It was like, no, I know, it couldn't be that guy, because the guy, he was blind. This guy sees, clearly not the same guy, because that's not how it works, right? Let's look at a couple other accounts. Exodus chapter 8. Exodus chapter 8. Something we might read through in preparation for the Days of Unleavened Bread as we go over the account of what Israel was enduring while they were in captivity in Egypt. We go through these plagues. This is plague number 3. I know the kids went over this in Sabbath school, so if you want to have a discussion with them about plagues and all the other fun things, you probably can. Exodus chapter 8, verse 16 is where we are. Exodus chapter 8, verse 16, the third plague, which is that of lice. We'll read Exodus chapter 8, verses 16 through 19. And the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your rod and strike the dust of the land so that it may become lice throughout all the land of Egypt. And so they did. For Aaron stretched out his hand with his rod and struck the dust of the earth, and it became lice on man and beast. All the dust of the land became lice throughout all the land of Egypt. Now the magicians, these are Pharaoh's magicians, so worked with their enchantments to bring forth lice, but they could not. So there was lice on man and beast. Then the magician said to Pharaoh, this This is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart grew hard, and he did not heed them, just as the Lord had said. If you go through the account, you have the blood, water turned to blood, and then you have the summoning of all these frogs that are coming everywhere. Well, the magicians were able to do that. They're like, oh, turn water into blood, done. Pharaoh's like, whatever, parlor trick, take a hike, Moses, not going to happen. Right? Then it's like, oh, the frogs, my guys can do that too. Then his magicians say, so we can't do that lice thing that he did. That's the finger of God. And Pharaoh's like, still not going to listen, right? So the magicians saw a difference between what they could do. Pharaoh, again, being belligerent, not willing to look or to see what was there. Another one, let's go to Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11, often referred to as the faith chapter, Hebrews chapter 11. We'll read verses 27. We'll start in verse 27. This kind of goes back over a little bit the account of Moses, speaking of his faith in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 27. By faith, Moses forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, but he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so, were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. Out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trials of mockings and scourging, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskin and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. These individuals that it's speaking of here in Hebrews 11, I mean, we oftentimes recount this when we're talking about the Exodus and going out of Egypt, and probably every one of us has a vision of Yul Brynner and Charlton Heston and those walls of water, and we have those visions because like somebody put that together so that we could have an idea of what it would look like to leave, and we've seen that, and so these people saw that. They saw what it was like having to leave Egypt when there's not a household in the nation that wasn't touched by the death of the firstborn, and there's grieving. If you're Gideon and you're looking at that fleece, and you're like, well, it is wet, right? You're seeing these things. Being an eyewitness, when we're talking about Christianity, is an important thing. I think I referenced this the last time, that when the 11 came together after the crucifixion of Jesus and Judas commits suicide, he hangs himself, they're like, we need to have another voice because Jesus started off with 12, we need to have 12. And so one of their parameters was, who's been with us to see from the very beginning of the ministry of John the Baptist, to who has seen essentially not the resurrection, but the baptism of Jesus Christ. Who has seen it all? Because for those who have seen, it's much harder to deny. It's not impossible, because you might have noticed in each of those three accounts that we went through John 9, where Jesus heals the blind man. We went through Exodus 8, where we're seeing the magicians notice that I can't do that trick. And when you talk about in Hebrews 11, and there are many individuals who, through that time, even though they saw the things, they didn't believe. Being an eyewitness is actually not enough. Let's go to John 12. John 12, verse 37. John chapter 12, verse 37. It can be enough. I shouldn't say it's not enough, just flat out. But it's one of those things that sometimes we might want a little bit more. John chapter 12, verse 37. John 12, verse 37. Speaking of Jesus, it says, although he, Jesus, had done so many signs before them, they, the masses of people, did not believe in him, that the word of Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spoke. Lord, who has believed our report? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Therefore they could not believe, because Isaiah had said, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts, lest they should see with their eyes, lest they should understand with their heart, and turn, so that I should heal them. These things Isaiah said when he saw his glory and spoke of him. Nevertheless, even among the rulers, many believed in him. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. For they love the praise of men more than the praise of God. There are times when we can see it. And I'm sure we've probably interacted with people who are like, how can they not see it? It's right there in black and white and sometimes in red, right? We're looking at the scriptures. How could they not see it? Well, there are times where people say, I can see it, but that's going to cost me a lot. I'm not going to sell all that I have and give it to the poor and take up my cross and follow you. That's a bit much. So sometimes being eyewitness to things is not enough. And I think that Luke recognized that, because seeing, and I think God also recognized that, because just seeing it, sometimes our human nature will go back and start to question things. If you watch any kind of courtroom drama, or if you're a fan of any legal sort of novel, you will probably be aware of the eyewitness effect and how unreliable it can be when you have multiple people who see the same thing and you ask them for an account. They're like, oh, clearly the guy was 6 foot tall, he was wearing khakis, and he had a polo shirt on. You talk to someone else, I think he was about 5'8". He was and it just changes when you talk to people. And you might find this when you, if you think about your memories growing up. I know that the first house that I ever lived in, I have implanted into, they had that movie a while ago, is Inception. I have implanted into my memory of what that house looked like, the kitchen from the second house that I was in. I have no idea what that first house looked like. I've implanted something from when I was older and could put a memory back into there. And so sometimes being eyewitness to it is not enough. And this is where the second component of what Luke brought out is so important when we're thinking about our Christian walk with God. What is it that we can do? What do we take from all of this that we've covered regarding Jesus? And that is document what happened. Document what happened. That's exactly what Luke said that he was doing. He says, I want to record this account from the eyewitnesses for you, O Theophilus, so that, you can be more assured of things. The saying a while ago, a few years back, and was a pics or it didn't happen. If you don't take pictures, didn't happen. Did you go to vacation? Nobody knows. I think you were just staying at home, eating Cheetos and watching movies, right? You didn't actually go on vacation. So if you don't have documentation of it occurring, maybe it didn't happen. And I think God recognized this, because if you go back to Exodus chapter 12, let's turn back there. Exodus chapter 12. We'll start in verse 21. Exodus chapter 12, verse 21. Exodus chapter 12, verse 21. I think this is also why part of this, that documentation of it, assists with keeping things. You have those records. You can go back and you can access them. You can read over them. Exodus chapter 12, verse 21. We'll read verse 21 through 27. It says, Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, Pick out and take lambs for yourselves according to your families and kill the Passover lamb. And you take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. And none of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning. For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your house to strike you. And you shall observe this thing as an ordinance for you and your sons forever. It shall come to pass that when you come to the land which the Lord will give you, just as he promised, that you shall keep this service. And it shall be, when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? That you shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice of the Lord, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt, when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our households. So the people bowed their heads and worshipped. So part of that documentation, we not only have what Moses wrote here, but he says, oral tradition, right? You pass it down. How many of us get together as a family? And when you get together as a family, you're pretty sure that about 2 hours into the gathering, Uncle so-and-so is going to start telling his story. And you know the story. You could probably mouth it by heart. You've heard it 1,000 times. But you get together as a family, and this is what you do, right? Well, if you bring a lamb into your house, and you keep it for 10 days, and you're watching this lamb, and you're trying to figure out, is it perfect? It's like, why'd they bring the lamb in the house? This is weird. Oh, and then you slaughter the lamb, and you put it on the doorpost. You're like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this, Dad? Mom, this is weird, right? He said, well, tell them, this is why we're doing it. So there's a recollection, there's a remembrance. You can go, Scripture is full of the word remember. All these things that God wanted his people to remember. When you have oral tradition, when everything is not fully written out, and we do know that there were still scribes, and they did record things as well, but there's different ways to document it. And you might do this where you go back, and if you take pictures with your family, or you go on a trip, you go to the Feast of Tabernacles, you take pictures like, oh, that's when that happened. That's who that was. I remember back when we did X, Y, Z, and all these other memories start flooding in. Well, God tells Israel, he says, I want you've seen this. You saw how I passed over and I protected you from the destroyer. You saw how all of this occurred when you left Egypt. You saw that there was goodwill extended to you because all these Egyptians are giving you things. They want to come with you. I mean, you used to be their slaves. And now they're like, hey, you're the people. We want to be on your side. Let's go. It's like Rahab saw, and she knew, and she actually accounted to the spies. She says, oh, we know about you. We know what you did to Egypt and all the other nations as you guys went out of Egypt. We know. We have record of that. And so God tells Israel to keep record, to remember. And he says to pass it on to their children, documenting what happened. Same book, chapter 34, Exodus 34. Exodus chapter 34, we'll start off verse 1. Exodus 34, verse 1. This is part 2, right? Part 1, Moses got angry, threw him down, and broke him. This is take 2. This is the redux, if you will. Exodus 34, verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, cut 2 tablets of stone like the first ones, and I will write on these tablets the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. I find that funny, sorry. So, be ready in the morning and come up in the morning to Mount Sinai and present yourself to me there on the top of the mountain. And no man shall come with you, and let no man be seen throughout all the mountain. Let neither flocks nor herds feed before that mountain. So he cut 2 tablets of stone like the first ones. And Moses rose early in the morning, he went up Mount Sinai, as the Lord had commanded him, and he took in his hand the 2 tablets of stone. So the Lord comes down. Now let's go to verse 10. And he said, behold, I make a covenant before all your people. I will do marvels such as have not been done in all the earth, nor in any nation, and all the people among whom you are shall see the work of the Lord. See, there is something to be seen in all of the people around Israel. It seemed like everybody but Israel acknowledged what they had seen. For it's an awesome thing that I will do with you. Verse 11, Observe what I command you this day. Behold, I am driving out from before you the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. Take heed to yourself, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land where you are going, lest it be a snare in your midst. But you shall destroy their altars, break their sacred pillars, and cut down their wooden images. Let's jump down to, where are we? Let's jump down to verse 25. Accounting the sacrifices with the Passover, he says, you shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leaven, nor shall the sacrifice of the feast of the Passover be left until morning. The first of the first fruits of your land you shall bring to the house of the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young kid in its mother's milk. And the Lord said to Moses, here, verse 27, write these words. All the stuff that God has been talking to Moses about. God came down Mount Sinai. Moses went up to meet him. He says, write these words, for according to the tenor of these words, I have made a covenant with you and Israel. And everything that you can read through chapter 34, these are what God is saying to Moses. He says, according to these words, I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. So he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights, and he ate neither bread nor drank water, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. So God writes it down. If you wonder, every time you push agree on that little box that pops up that stops you from doing the internet search that you needed to do, you're agreeing to this massive contract of how they're going to track you, how they're going to utilize your cookies, how they're going to, all this stuff, right? It's a contract. It's right there. And try to read through that. But like anything else, it is a contract, and God says, I want to make it very clear. Here are these 2 tablets of stone that we know were later on placed inside of the Ark of the Covenant. It's like, this is the contract that I'm cutting with you. This is the covenant that I'm making with you. It is written down. Now, I don't know how big the tablets of stone were, but small enough they could fit inside of the Ark of the Covenant, which was not a huge box. And so you have these 2 tablets of stone there. It's written on that. I don't know how hard it is to write small on stone, but I'm guessing it would have been less than 2 pages of a contract that we would read today, which is like, try to find a 2-page contract. That's like, you never find those. They're full of all these addendums and appendices, and here, go over this spot, and this is the opt-out clause. God's like, here's what it is. It's so straightforward. I want you to see it. I want you to look at it. You've seen everything. I want you to be my people. I want to do a wondrous work with you, so that all the nations around, when they see what is going on here, they will also know that I am the Lord. They will also want to be a part of the family that I'm building. And so God documents that contract. And the whole of the Old Testament is him saying, you guys agreed to this contract. You're not abiding by the contract. He's like the most compassionate landlord ever. No, you haven't paid the rent. Okay, I'll give you another month, right? It's just like he's just so long-suffering, so merciful. Let's go to Joshua chapter 4, and let's look at another bit of documentation, a different kind, but Joshua chapter 4. So Exodus 34, as well as the children of Israel are still out in the wilderness. They're still at Sinai. They have not left yet. Here at the tail end of those 40 years, or after the 40 years of wandering, actually, they're getting ready to cross over into the Promised Land, to go across the Jordan. Now, if you go through Deuteronomy, you'll see that God reiterated the entirety of the covenant with them. You can go through Deuteronomy, I think it's 5. Missing whether it's 5 or 6, where he goes back over the 10 Commandments, and you have in 16 he's going through the Passover. He goes through everything with that next generation. And here in Joshua chapter 4, we'll pick it up in verse 4. They're getting ready to go over the Jordan, and Joshua tells 12 men, one from each tribe, to take up a stone. And so in verse 3 he calls them. Or verse 4, he calls them, and the 12 men whom he had appointed from the children of Israel, one man from every tribe. Joshua said to them, cross over before the ark of the Lord your God, into the midst of the Jordan. Each one of you take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel, that this may be a sign among you, when your children ask in time, saying, what do these stones mean to you? If you've ever been hiking, you see the little stacked stones, the little cairns, as they call them. You get something, you got these stones, you're putting them 12 high. You're crossing over the Jordan. He's like, why are those stones there? It's just like in Exodus. Well, why are we doing this Passover service? Well, because God delivered us. Okay, well, now we're moving beyond that. It's like, well, because God is bringing us into the promised land, just like he promised our forefathers. We're going into to inherit it. It's documented. Why is that there? You can go. There are so many accounts of God documenting things. It's like just as the pillar of salt for Lot's wife, and just as this is there to that day, and they'll talk about these various things that you call on them as a memorial, as a remembrance. People who've been in the Church of God for a while might be like, oh, remember when we were over in Squaw Valley? You can go back and you can see where, oh, remember they had this other feast site up in the Dells, and you can go back and you can see that. There are these things that people relate to. They're kind of like standards that are placed down in the ground along the journey. And here God is telling Israel to do that. Joshua, God through Joshua, is telling Israel to do that, to remember and to document him making good on his word. Sadly, though, sometimes recording might not be enough. Even if you see it, even if you write it down, that might not be enough. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 30. Isaiah chapter 30. It's been a few years. The children of Israel have been in the land for a good bit of time. Not a obedient bit of time, but they are not following God, and God, through the prophet Isaiah, has this to say. Isaiah chapter 30, verse 8 through 11. Isaiah 30, verse 8 through 11. He tells Isaiah, he says, now go, write it before them on a tablet, and note it on a scroll, that it may be for time to come, forever and ever, that this, speaking of Israel, is a rebellious people, lying children, children who will not hear the law of the Lord, who say to the seers, do not see, and to the prophets, do not prophesy to us right things. Speak to us smooth things, prophesy deceits. Get out of the way, turn aside from the path, cause the Holy One of Israel to cease from before us. So there's a record. They saw. These are the same people who crossed over, who should have had all these recordings, all the documentation. They had all of that. Their forefathers had seen it. And now a different kind of recording is made, and it is that substantiates their rebellion, their disobedience to God. Sometimes, for some individuals, seeing it and remembering it through documenting it is not enough. But that brings about the third thing that we can learn from what Luke said in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Let's turn back there. Luke chapter 1. This is kind of the crux. This is the hard part. Because everybody loves a show. It's easy to go see something. I'd love to see 5,000, 3,000 people get fed with 12 baskets of remains from just a few fish and loaves. That's pretty amazing. I'd like to see a guy walk on water. I'd love to actually see the water of the Jordan heap up on one side and just goes dried out, and the little fish probably like flopping and all this stuff that's going on. You can just imagine that. Was it like a tsunami? What was it like? That'd be pretty amazing. Amazing to see these things. And if somebody writes it down, you're like, oh, I trust you. You were there. You saw it, right? And you wrote this down. Okay. I believe him. But then time goes by, and there's a little bit more space between the person who saw it, the person who recorded it, the person who can recount it, and you're like, well, I really think what's recorded here is it's not actually factual and historical. This is something that was written down for the essence of trying to bring us along in the concepts. It's not really God's word, but it's really about molding humanity to be able to come to their own set of moral and ethical underpinnings, right? And so you can lose maybe a little bit of the understanding of it being important when you give a little bit of time and space between what was seen, by whom it was seen, and when it was written down. But here over in Luke chapter 1, again, we'll read verses 1 through 4. It says, "Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed." Luke spoke to the eyewitnesses so that he could record what they had seen accurately, that corroborated with everything that they had been taught by others, so that people could become certain. And this is the hard thing for us as Christians. Becoming certain. How do you become certain for something that you didn't see? I mean, we read Hebrews 11, we talk about it, it's like, oh, by faith these people did that. How do you have faith enough to forego something that is right here in front of you for something you're like, maybe that's going to happen? I think it's going to happen. I mean, well, but what if we're wrong? Well, if we're wrong and this life is all that there is, we are all men most pitiable, it says, right? So maybe we're just a bunch of pathetic people doing the wrong thing. You ever have a crisis of faith like that? It's hard to become certain. So I'm going to try to, as we look at 3 different scriptures, ascertain perhaps how we can pursue that in our Christian walk. Let's go to Judges chapter 6. Judges chapter 6. I had referenced this when we read about him in Hebrews 11. But Judges chapter 6, an individual who I think probably many of us can see ourselves in at times. Judges chapter 6, verse 36. This is amidst the story of Gideon. Judges chapter 6, verse 36 is where we're going to pick it up. We'll read through to verse 40. But this guy is called to go and defy his father, to start with, and tear down an altar, which gets the whole city pretty angry. And that might cause you to be like, well, maybe not the best choice to do. So then God says, well, I'm going to do something else with you. And he's like, I'd like to just be certain that is really you talking to me, and I'm not just here trying to throw away all of my future. And so he says, verse 36, Gideon says to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, look, I shall put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. And it was so. When he rose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece together, he wrung the dew out of the fleece, a bowl full of water. And Gideon thought, somebody heard me praying. They clearly brought over the bowl, poured it on the fleece. That was a dumb question to try to ask God to, because anybody could have done that. And so he says, do not be angry with me, but let me speak just once more. Let me test, I pray, just once more with the fleece. Let it now be dry only on the fleece, but on the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night. It was dry on the fleece only, but there was dew on all the ground. Now that's tough, because when it dews, you can see where people walk, because they disturb the ground. And Gideon's like, okay, here we go. Sometimes, to be certain, have you ever prayed a prayer multiple times? Just in case. Was I faithful enough the first time? Was I in a right mind? Was I being obedient to be, as James talks about, I don't want to ask amiss, right? We do this sometimes to pursue a little bit more certainty. And that's not bad. God says, ask, seek, knock. Sometimes I go all 3, right? Well, today I'm going to knock. No. Go all 3. Do it, pursue him. I don't think there's anything wrong with pursuing him as long as we're willing to accept the answer that he gives. And Gideon came to the point where it's like, he's asking in a way. He's asking out of faith, but also asking out of uncertainty. Show me which way I'm supposed to go. There is nothing wrong with asking God for that kind of clarity. Not at all. And I will say that it doesn't matter how long you have been walking this way, how long have you been baptized. I say it often, different people have different levels of faith in different areas of life. And as such, you might hear somebody be like, why do you have a problem with that? That's easy for me. Well, fine, but I'm struggling with it. And so you can ask for help. You can ask for God to assist with the certainty. Let's go to Exodus chapter 4. Exodus chapter 4. I really appreciate many of the interactions that I read between God and Moses, as I mentioned earlier. It's like, those tablets that you broke. We get here in Exodus chapter 4, the kind of the beginning of their interactions as they're talking about it. It's kind of like, those stiff-necked people that you brought out of Egypt, they're doing stuff, Moses. I just find it humorous. But here we get a little bit of this at the beginning of Moses being called. Exodus chapter 4. Verse, I have 18 here, but that's not where I want to start. So I actually want to go back to verse 10. Verse 10. Exodus chapter 4, verse 10. So Moses has seen the burning bush, right? And God is talking to him. And God's telling him he wants him to go and do things before Pharaoh. And he gives him the sign of having a leper's hand and a non-leper's hand. When he goes in and out of his garment, he draws it out. That's in verse 7. And talks about more signs in verse 9. And in verse 10, Moses says to the Lord, "Oh, my Lord, I am not eloquent. I am not eloquent, neither before nor since. I have a hard time. I'm not a what do they call it? A wordsmith. Yeah, I'm not that. I don't say the words good." He's just coming up with all these reasons as to why he's not eloquent. He's slow of speech, slow of tongue. And the Lord says to him, Who made man's mouth? Or who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall say. But Moses says, "Oh, my Lord, please send by the hand of whomever else. Anybody else, really, other than me. Anyone else, you can send them." So the anger, verse 14, of the Lord was kindled against Moses. He said, "Is not Aaron the Levite your brother? I know that he can speak well. And look, he is also coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. Now you shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and I will teach you what you shall do. So he shall be your spokesman to the people, and he himself shall be a mouth for you, and you shall be to him as God. And you shall take this rod in your hand with which you shall do the signs." So Moses went and returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, "Please let me go and return to my brethren who are in Egypt to see whether they are still alive." And Jethro says to Moses, "Go in peace." So kind of like Gideon. Now Gideon was asking for signs. Moses was stalling, coming up with excuses. Sometimes we test God's patience with our stalling in his belief. You see a burning bush, like, hold on, but the bush is not being consumed. You hear a voice that tells you to take off your sandals. Okay. Bush, voice, your hand, leprous, not leprous. That's strange. What else can I do to get out of this? Like, how long does it take you to get to the point of belief? God has a threshold, and I think he hits this here. He's like, "I'm using you, Moses. Your brother's coming. You're going to do this job." You can see this with Jeremiah as well. He's like, "Stop whining about it. Go and do and tell them what I told you to do." There is a threshold for God's patience on that. But sometimes, I will say he's also gracious. He did the same thing with Elijah, right? Elijah's like, "Oh, yeah, let him I'm left. Stop whining, go do anoint who I told you, and I'll give you a reprieve. Go train Elisha, right? And so God understands and he hears, but there is something there which, if you're certain of it, stop trying to balk and get out of the work. Stop trying to get out of the job. When we're walking this way, we have seen it. You document it, and you have to get to the point of being certain and not just trying to pass the buck, as they say. Let's go to Matthew 26. Let's look at another aspect of becoming certain here. I think it's wonderful that we have as much recorded in the relationship between God and Moses, because what we get to see is truly, he says, I talked to Moses face to face. He's conversing with him. You see Moses go to bat for those stiff-necked people, and you get this back and forth. And it was there really from the beginning. He's like, no. He's like, but Moses did it. Moses went there. He was not without his fault. As such are every single one of us. But Matthew chapter 26. Matthew 26, verse 38. Again, a passage that we oftentimes read, either at the Passover service or in preparation for it. Matthew 26, verse 38. Then he, speaking of Jesus, said, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me. He's saying this to Peter, James, and John. He went a little farther and fell on his face and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Verse 42, again a second time he went away and prayed, saying, O my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done. Now we can read in Peter, and we can read all of the other prophecies. You can read through John. Before the foundation of the world, Jesus Christ knew, the Word knew that he would have to divest himself of his glory, come in the form of a bondservant of a man, and offer himself as a sacrifice for all of humanity so that we would have the opportunity to be in God's family. He knew that. That's what the plan was. That's why all that background and the proof for who Jesus was and how he was the Messiah, all of that was recorded. So why? Why do we have this? Well, it's because it shows us that he is man, he is human. Now, he wasn't catering to a different will. But there are times you're like, are you certain that this is how it has to be? And he asks it twice. And he's okay with the outcome. He's not trying to get out of it like Moses. He's not asking for more signs from God to make it different like Gideon was. But he is still asking the questions like, are you certain that this is the route? Have you ever had that? I've had that where I'm like, is this the route that we're going? I don't know. Am I pushing on the wrong door? Do I need to step back a few to be able to reconsider how I'm approaching it? And Jesus is asking that of his Father. Sometimes we do need to check in with God to make sure that we're on the right path. That helps us to be certain. If you're ever uncertain, we can do what Gideon did. We can do what Moses did. And God's like, move it. We can do what Jesus did. Because in each of our lives, the beauty is that God is working wondrous miracles for those who have eyes to see them, a willingness to see them. And those should be much like all of the detail that was there in the history, the backdrop of the life of Jesus Christ, even before his ministry ever began. You're like, this is him. This is the Messiah. Clearly, right? We can look back and we can see it, and individuals at that time also saw it. Some didn't want to see what they saw or admit what they saw because we want to keep our positions. But if we have seen it, I think it's important for us to document it, and it's important for us to then become certain. Let's go, in closing, let's go to Hebrews chapter 11. It is so important for us as Christians to notice what we see and hear. We cannot be Christians who kind of just float through life and be like, what a blessing, what is this? And then you forget about it. We can't let them just fly off out of our minds and out of our memory. We have to document it. Whether it's a picture or whether you decide to journal or whatever it is that you do, you must find a way of document it so you can remember what you've seen, remember what you've heard, pass it on to your kids so that they can also begin to develop that relationship, because without it, you don't develop a love of the truth, and we don't have what we read here in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11, verse 13. Hebrews 11, verse 13. It says, "These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them." If we don't get to the point of certainty for the things that we have seen, how could we possibly be certain of the things that we have not seen? And this is where it's about the character of our Father. When we understand him as our Father, and we understand who he is and what he has done and what his Son has done for us, well, then we should be willing to transfer that across time and space to our life and to the future that he has planned for us. Back here over in Hebrews 11, verse 13, "These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them." This is God's plan for all of humanity. And nobody in this room has directly seen the birth, the baptism, trial, the crucifixion, or the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, we can read firsthand accounts. We know the scriptures. And we know from the scriptures that the gates of hell will never prevail against God's church. And so we have passed down from generation to generation to generation over the last 2,000 some odd years, a record and an account of what occurred. And we should again be able to take that, overlay on top of that the interactions that we have had with our Father, the relationship that he has built with us, and what we have seen, what we have heard, what we have written down, so that we can become certain, just like what Luke said. Let's close there. Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1, verse 4. It says that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed. Let's make sure that we are certain of our calling and certain of what God has laid out for each and every one of us.